A camping trip takes a terrifying turn when Ted wakes up to find himself trapped in an outlandish, sparkly fairy outfit. His attempts to escape his humiliating predicament only lead to further transformations, leaving him questioning his sanity and fearing for his future. Also, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and leave a like if you enjoy these videos. It really helps us out. Enjoy the story.
Deep within the woods, miles from any permanent civilization, a place known only to campers, fishermen, hikers, and bears, lived a tiny caterpillar. Unlike most yellow and black varieties that inhabited the area, this tiny fellow shone bright with highlights of pink and green and remained well hidden and invisible to the people who enjoyed the ambiance of his woodland home. The tiny caterpillar enjoyed his solitude and privacy, but was fascinated by the strange gatherings that would sometimes take place near his home. Strange, wonderful creatures, tall, colorful things walking on two legs, carrying glowing sticks with two arms, would sometimes convene within the woods and dance frenetically around each other. Loud drums would beat steadily from huge black boxes that the creatures brought, along with things he could only assume were gods, dancing beside spinning discs of power, seemingly controlling the heavy beat that echoed through the woods. Their natural body armor was a beautiful sight. They were wrapped with thick body armor that showed off every color of the rainbow, which was a wise decision considering how many predators existed in the surrounding mountains. The caterpillar loved these beings and watched over them every chance he had. He would readily give his life to protect their safety, as he felt a great importance over their activities in this world. One day, as he awoke from his cozy 3-day nap, the tiny caterpillar looked around his woods and saw something very peculiar. There were 8 large domes gathered together where he normally took his midnight stroll. How strange, he thought, inching himself down the tree and along the ground to get a better look. Soon, sitting at the base of one of the strange shapes, he made the fantastic conclusion. These were cocoons. Not just any cocoons, huge cocoons. No doubt, this was where the beings spun their own cocoons and transformed into the magnificent creatures that danced at the gatherings. He squeezed his way inside through a tiny hole and adventured within unknown lands. Once inside, the pink caterpillar was shocked. This was like no cocoon he had ever seen before. There was entirely too much space. The walls were spun far too thin to keep out any sort of predator, and it was just as cold inside as it was out. His tiesks and other varied sounds of disappointment quickly turned to alarm as he saw an enormous pink figure lying within a half-opened sack, its entire upper body exposed to the elements. The tiny caterpillar panicked and gave a tiny shriek of horror, for he had stumbled upon one of the beings, although a being unlike any he had seen before. Whereas the beings at the gatherings had bright, distinctive patterned armor and shells, this one was completely pale, save a tiny mat of shaggy armor on top of its head. Immediately, the caterpillar realized what had happened. This was not a being, but a being's larva, only halfway finished with its cocoon, left alone out in the elements to be eaten by a horrible, greedy predator. The tiny caterpillar had never seen a being's larva before, and the sight of a dying, vulnerable one filled his heart with a sadness he had never felt before. Quickly crawling closer to the being's mouth, the caterpillar listened for any evidence of wind passing through its face. After a few tense moments, the slightest gasp came from within its body, and excitement and hope filled its tiny soul. There was still time for this larva to become one with its society and join the gatherings when they returned to the woods. He would have to hurry, as time was short. This was finally his chance to prove to the universe how much he cared for these beings. He had lived his life, enjoyed many a millennium observing the world, and was now ready to sacrifice himself for one last noble deed. Something so selfless that he would earn his place with his great ancestors in the wormy beyond. The caterpillar was host to an incredible fountain of power. But instead of moving mountains or parting oceans, he wanted to give this poor being something special, something only for it to enjoy, something that would last forever. With no time to waste, he set himself upon the unconscious larva and shot a quick blast of silk on the top of its head, covering the small amount of armor it had grown, instantly reinforcing it. He focused his energy and began moving down the being's chest, past the half-open cocoon, moving faster and faster as he did so. Silk began shooting out of the pink caterpillar at an incredible rate, with the tiny soul flipping and zipping around, forcing himself underneath the half-cocooned being, wrapping the silk as tight as possible. The pink caterpillar could feel his energy quickly draining and knew the ultimate sacrifice was near. Still, he pressed on, becoming a pink blur of silk focused on only one thing: saving the being. In only a matter of minutes, the pink caterpillar had sealed the exposed larva completely within his warm, protective silk, protected from the harsh environment surrounding them within the woods. The caterpillar stood and raised many of its tiny legs, waving them to and fro, funneling more of its life force to the newly made cocoon. The metamorphosis had begun and quickly began to accelerate, which would allow the being's true form to hatch within hours instead of weeks, as there was no time to waste in getting it free from the potentially dangerous woods and back to a gathering where it belonged. Something was slightly amiss with this larva. It seemed different than the beings he had seen at the gatherings. Its body was oddly shaped compared to what he remembered, sticking out in all the wrong places. The poor thing was deformed. "No matter," thought the caterpillar. "It's nothing I can't fix." With that, a firm goo filled the cocoon and began to twist and reshape itself to the caterpillar's whim. The larva had its numerous flaws and differences hidden by the liquid armor, which formed itself according to the features favored by the caterpillar over his many years of visiting the gatherings. The goo within the cocoon made its way to the larva's face, melting itself into place, reforming based on various memories from the caterpillar, turning into something special that would truly make this fantastic being fit in with the others, no matter what it was born like. No one would ever know the secret contained underneath this special material. After the larva was coated in the first layer of primordial goo, the caterpillar began to imbue his knowledge of hundreds of gatherings into the magically spun cocoon, which immediately began to form new material onto the young larva, its feet and body covered with the first frameworks of its new home. He concentrated and melded his memories together, recalling his favorite colorful shells and armor the beings had worn while dancing all through the night, then incorporating them into the ultimate armored shell for the sleeping larva to inhabit. Focusing on the memory of these shells, he set a change upon the larva that would cover it with its own special armor to inhabit, an impervious home that contained the caterpillar's ancient powers and would withstand any sort of earthly attack. He smiled as he sensed the different pieces of armor forming from the goo within and settling into their final shape. The caterpillar wanted to assure the being that its impervious armor was the only protection it would ever need, but he knew he wouldn't live long enough to see the larva hatch and teach it about it. The young being was bound to feel threatened in its new environment and not understand the power it was surrounded and protected by. Focusing his power again, the caterpillar imbued the being's armor with a very unique power, one that no other being would ever have. One that would reveal itself at the right time, when the being felt threatened and decided to protect itself with a laughably inferior shell or armor. The power would unleash itself then, and only then, and prove that the shell the being inhabited was all it would ever need. With his final dying motion, the caterpillar himself transformed into a ball of pink light and floated within the cocoon, giving the tent a beautiful glow. This being was to be his child, his legacy to the world, an eternal being that would lead all beings into a new golden age of gatherings all around the world. With that, the caterpillar's spirit fizzled out and left existence forever. Waking with a start, Ted instantly knew that something was amiss in his tent. Somehow, in the pitch-black confines of his tent, he could tell something was different. His body felt numb, his legs were cold, and he had the taste of cotton candy all over his lips. Wait, candy? He didn't bring any candy on this trip. Neither did any of his friends. This was a hot dog and burger trip. He wouldn't be caught dead eating kids' candy in front of his friends. He shivered and was met with the sudden realization that instead of being cozy in a nice warm blanket, he was lying on the floor of the tent. His sleeping bag was nowhere to be found. He grumbled and sat up, which hit him with a barrage of sensations that he wasn't quite ready for, nor would most likely ever be ready for. First off, something was pinching his head, hard. There were two solid points on his scalp that felt like they were trying to pull his hair out, which was exacerbated by two very large and very heavy weights, something that swished and swung back and forth as he turned his head in the darkness. Not only that, his entire body felt bizarre and out of proportion. It felt like he had been sleeping on a bunch of rocks all night. Soft rocks, ones that pushed his body around in awkward places. Rocks that seemed to jiggle and follow him as he shuffled around, seated on the hard floor of the tent. His legs, in particular, felt incredibly smooth, yet very constricted. Did he wear long johns to bed? He couldn't remember. He did have a sheet twisted around his waist, though, although he didn't remember bringing it. He twisted and pulled at it, but it was too tangled to stretch anywhere past his thighs. Trying to wiggle his toes, he found he could barely make them move, as his feet were cramped and packed into something heavy and big. Wait. He knew that he had taken his shoes off before getting into the tent. Reaching around in the darkness, he was beginning to sense that something was very, very wrong. Ted's brain hollered out inside his skull as his blind groping in the darkness landed his hands on his chest, which found themselves pressed against a heavy, round, soft, fluffy weight. His hands shot back to his sides as if they'd grabbed a handful of molten lead, sending the mound swaying heavily side to side. He carefully cupped both hands around these foreign bodies, breathing in quick breaths as panic and utter confusion coursed through his brain, burying his hands further into the gelatinous bulge. What were these? What happened last night? Did he fall asleep first? Were the guys messing with him? What did they do? Whatever was wrapping itself around his chest, he definitely didn't want it there any longer. Grabbing both of the soft, fluffy mounds, he quickly pulled as hard as he could, only to have them stretch from his chest and violently smack back, bouncing around within their fur confines like crazy. He grabbed again, mashing them around, trying to push whatever it was inside the fur lining out, but all parts of the material were stuck straight to his skin. As much as he smacked, pinched, and pulled on them, the only pain Ted felt was the pull of these things on his chest, meaning he hadn't grown tits in the middle of the night. Some prankster must have attached them to him, rather unwillingly. He couldn't take being in the pitch-black tent anymore and needed to take action now. In order to get any sort of visual bearing on the situation, Ted knew that he needed to find a flashlight. Right. Now. He let go of his chest and got onto his knees, which gave him a jolt as the back of his thighs squished against something very large and soft, and Ted was suddenly filled with the sensation that he had sat on a reasonably large wild animal. He threw himself to the side of the tent, colliding with the thin walls, mashing against it with the heavy weight attached to his head, pulling and whipping themselves around the empty space as he did. He pushed blindly at his feet, again feeling the thick body of a furry woodland creature, albeit with much less panic and much more horror. Where he thought there might be a vengeful beaver or a huge, vicious squirrel, there was actually a large, thick tube of fur wrapped tightly around each of his feet. His hands sank into the soft landscape and felt the bulk of them going all the way up to his calves. He had no idea what was happening, but he knew two things for sure. He was wearing huge, fuzzy boots, and he was sporting a large pair of fuzzy breasts. As his hands left the boots, they continued up his legs, which seemed to be much less sensitive than they usually were when he wasn't wearing pants. He felt around his thighs, feeling as if they had been wrapped in something as well. Something very thin, very smooth, very delicate. Ted was getting very afraid of the mental image he was gathering from all these tactical sensations. He started kicking the boots off as he felt incredibly creeped out by the fuzzy beasts and didn't want them anywhere near his legs. He sunk his right sole into his left boot and pushed hard, only to have the boot completely resist his efforts. He grunted a number of silent obscenities as he begrudgingly wrapped both his hands around his right boot, getting the full sensation and experience of his furry new apparel, and gave a mighty pull, only to find the boot had been firmly attached to him. What the hell is going on with this thing? This is getting ridiculous, Ted thought. Whoever pulled this prank is going to pay. He snapped out of his attempt to free his feet and started feeling around the wall of the tent, exploring until his hands met the bare length of the zipper. A minor note of relief washed over him, and he quickly felt the zipper all the way to the floor and quickly zipped open the exit to his pitch-black nightmare. His escape was short-lived. as something attached to his back quickly pressed against the roof of the tent, quickly sitting him back to the floor, the big fluff of his feet gently cushioning his backside. Feeling around his shoulders, his hands landed on a stiff sheet of fabric sticking straight out from his back. No. Make that 2 sheets of fabric. He tried to yank them off in a fury, but was just as successful as he was with his boots. Not wanting to do any more explorations of his situation in pitch-black confines, he crawled as low as he could go, exiting the tent, the large contraption on his back swaying underneath the roof as he did so. Finally, free of the tent, Ted stood up, feeling a fluffing of fabric all around his thighs, a jiggling that had slowed to a halt on his chest, the constant constriction around his head, which seemed to enjoy whipping his face with something long and soft whenever he moved his head too fast. He felt around the bedsheet he was tangled in and immediately put it together. It was a skirt. Underneath the frilly piece of humiliation was a bizarre, swollen mass all over his ass and hips. He grabbed and rubbed it and was immediately reminded of the weights now swinging from his chest. In the dim moonlight, a slight metallic glint revealed Dave's truck parked near the trees, leaving his body and everything else obscured by darkness. Not wanting to be in this situation for much longer, he quickened his pace through the dark campsite. His quick steps were suddenly slowed to a literal tiptoe. The sound of his big boots had kicked up enough gravel to stir someone in another tent. "What? Who is, A drowsy voice murmured, followed by a loud rustling of a sleeping bag being turned over in a huff. All was quiet, minus the heavy heartbeat of a very confused young Ted, and soon it was apparent his disturbance didn't warrant an investigation. Moving again, this time much more carefully, Ted reached the truck and looked in the back, spotting the top of the flashlight in the small amount of moonlight available to him. He grabbed it, hesitated for a moment as he had no idea what he was about to see, set it down on the lip of the truck's box, and turned it on. The piercing light shot out and flooded the area with his shadow and a horde of pink and blue sparkles. Ted winced and squinted, his eyes familiar with the dark and a stranger to the light, and he turned his head away, seeing his shadow cast along the ground. He stared at the alien silhouette, focusing on the huge, shadowy towers standing up from his head, the large bottom that had somehow grown overnight, and the 2 very large and very obvious wings sticking out from behind him. He turned back toward the light, and although his eyes soon adjusted to it, they would never adjust to what he saw. He put his hands to his mouth, trapping a scream that would inevitably bring a circle of laughing, pointing campers. Looking down at himself, he was met with his familiar fuzzy friends sticking out from his chest. A very obvious and large pair of breasts contained within a furry green top, covered in a sparkling glitter that sent tiny flecks of light around him as he moved. Looking down further, he saw a poofy skirt surrounding his waist and a white, frilly froth of fabric peeking out from underneath. He lifted the skirt and grabbed around his crotch. His precious manhood was still there, all right, but seemed to be covered by a thick, soft, rubbery material. He picked at it and felt around below and gasped as his fingers ran across a narrow pair of holes, burrowing deep within the soft spheres of jelly that surrounded his torso. Whoever did this to him intended him to stay humiliated for a very long time. Since his new hip and ass wouldn't budge from his furious yanks, he'd have to sit to pee and poop, and that didn't sit well with him at all. And what was making his legs feel as strange as they did? A ridiculous pair of yellow and green tights. Were those hearts? They certainly were. Big green hearts all over the tights, like a radioactive raver leopard lurking in the yellow jungle. Pinching them revealed absolutely no give, which didn't surprise him at all. This was a pretty thorough job, and he was getting pissed. Since his breasts were difficult to look past, he had to bend way over to see what was grasping his feet. An absolutely ridiculous pair of pink fur bulges that swallowed his legs, complete with tiny bows on the toes and a constant feeling of their soft fur mashing against each other. The boots glittered and glinted in the artificial light as well, and were hugging his feet tight like there was no tomorrow. The analysis of his boots only took a fraction of a second, and it took yet another fraction for his outfit to interrupt his view, as 2 big fluffs of hair fell into his vision, swinging around and licking against each other, coming to an eventual rest. He grabbed both of them in shock, staring madly at the thick pink and blue locks pouring out from the top of his head, long strands of tinsel stuck in the poofy volume of it all, making his head a glittering beacon for only the most dedicated candy ravers. Feeling around his head, he could tell each of them was locked in place by a ribbon or a bow. He picked and pulled at whatever it was, but it stuck fast to the tower of pink. Ted turned to the truck and pulled the large side mirror over to see his face, and he instantly wished he hadn't. Framed underneath a thick wall of pink bangs was the most heavily made-up face he'd ever seen. He held his hand to his lips, the big fur cuff around his wrist introducing itself by licking his bare chest as he did so. Leaning in closer, he got a good look at his thick blue eyeshadow, his glossy, plump pink lips, his huge black eyelashes that apparently grew quite a bit while he was out. He put a hand to his cheek, which was now home to a beautiful rosy glow amidst a field of porcelain skin. Some sort of incredibly thick foundation had set itself in place, the blush fading perfectly into it in all directions. His eyeshadow and lips had the honor of being covered in pretty glitter, which is what sparked Ted to begin trying to remove it from his face immediately. He licked his lips and was met with the oddest sensation. His lips tasted like pure sour candy. He paused and wet his lips again tasting the burst of candy, as if it was coming up from his pores. He licked his lips again, building up a solid coating of spit, hoping to dilute his lipstick somewhat with his saliva, then madly began rubbing his fur-cuffed wrists all around his mouth and soon began rubbing the cuffs all over his entire face. After nearly giving his entire face rug burn, he peered into his reflection, only to see his perfect, flawless makeover perfectly intact. He froze in terror, knowing that only a second ago he had wiped his lips clean of any sort of gloss or candy residue, but he again could taste the sweet bite of candy on his lips once more. He picked at the eyelashes and winced in pain as his eyelid clung onto it for dear life. Tears welled up in his eyes, realizing that someone had glued them in place and he was now shaking with rage and fear. Once his tears had sufficiently welled up enough through a combination of facial pain and fear, he let go, watching a stream of tears run down his face, bringing absolutely no mascara, eyeliner, eyeshadow, or foundation along with it.